The sound of a lawnmower filled the quiet suburban street, the steady hum blending with the chirping birds and distant laughter of children playing. But amidst this peaceful summer afternoon, trouble was brewing. A woman stood on her front porch, arms crossed tightly, her phone clutched in her hand. Her face was twisted in suspicion, irritation, maybe even something darker. She was watching the black teenager pushing the mower across a neighbor's yard, and in her mind, something did not seem right. So she did what she always did when she saw something she did not like. She called 911. And what happened next would change everything. Before we go any further, subscribe to the channel and comment below where you are watching from. For 16-year-old Jamal Carter, mowing lawns was not just a summer job, it was a business. A way to save money. A way to help his mom with bills. A way to build something for himself. Every weekend, he pushed his old, slightly rusted lawnmower from house to house, offering his services for a small fee. Most of the neighbors knew him well. They had watched him grow up, seen him go from a kid riding his bike down the street to a hard-working teenager trying to make an honest living. But not everyone saw it that way. Not everyone wanted him there. And today, he was about to find out just how far some people would go to make sure he never felt welcome. The afternoon sun beat down as Jamal wiped the sweat from his forehead, pushing his mower in steady, even lines across Mr. Thompson's yard. Mr. Thompson was one of his best customers, an elderly man who appreciated Jamal's work ethic and always left an ice-cold lemonade waiting for him on the porch. "Take your time, kid," Mr. Thompson had said earlier, handing him the money up front, as he always did. "You do good work." Jamal had smiled at that, feeling a small sense of pride. He was just about halfway done with the yard when he noticed something strange. A woman standing across the street, watching him. At first, he ignored it. It was not the first time people had stared at him while he worked. But then, she pulled out her phone. And that was when Jamal felt it. That familiar sinking feeling in his stomach. That feeling that said, "Here we go again." The 911 call that changed everything. "Yes, I need to report something suspicious." The woman's voice was sharp, urgent, like she was watching a crime unfold. "There's a young black male with a lawnmower going through someone's yard. I don't think he belongs there." Her voice dripped with certainty, as if she knew without a doubt that this boy had no right to be there. "I don't know if he's casing the house or trying to steal something, but I need an officer here now." Jamal, unaware of what was happening, kept working, kept minding his own business, kept doing the job he had been paid to do. But inside her house, the woman was pacing, watching him through the blinds. Because in her mind, a black teenager with a lawnmower was not a hard-working kid. He was a threat. And when the police arrived, Jamal would learn just how dangerous that assumption could be. The sound of sirens shattered the peaceful afternoon. Jamal looked up confused, unsure, as two police cars pulled up to the curb. Doors opened. Officers stepped out. And within seconds, Jamal's entire world shifted. Because he was no longer just a teenager mowing a lawn. He was a suspect. And how this ended would shock everyone. Jamal wiped his hands on his jeans, his heartbeat pounding in his ears as the police cars pulled up. The flashing lights bounced off the surrounding houses, turning the quiet suburban street into a scene straight out of a crime drama. Except there was no crime. Just a 16-year-old with a lawnmower. And yet, the way the officers stepped out of their vehicles, their hands hovering near their belts, made it clear they had already decided something was wrong. One of the officers, a tall man with a stiff posture and unreadable expression, walked toward Jamal. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice firm, not friendly. "What are you doing here?" Jamal blinked, caught between confusion and frustration. Mowing the lawn?" he replied, gesturing toward the half-cut grass, as if it was not painfully obvious. The officer's gaze narrowed, as if Jamal's answer was somehow suspicious. "Whose house is this?" Jamal exhaled, fighting the urge to roll his eyes. "Mr. Thompson's. He hired me." The officer turned his head toward the house, scanning the windows. "And he just lets you come and go?" Jamal frowned. "Yeah, that's how it works when someone pays you to do a job. That was when the second officer, shorter, but with a face that looked permanently skeptical, stepped in. "Listen, son," he said, lowering his voice as if he was doing Jamal a favor. "We got a call about some suspicious activity. A neighbor said you were lurking around." Jamal's stomach clenched. "I wasn't lurking. I was working." But the officers weren't convinced. They were not looking at him like a hard-working teenager. They were looking at him like a problem. And no matter how reasonable his answers were, their expressions did not change. Before Jamal could say another word, a voice rang out from across the street. "Officers, over here." Jamal turned, already knowing who it was before he even saw her. Linda Pearson, the woman who had made the call in the first place. She hurried toward them, arms crossed, her expression a mix of smugness and fake concern. "I am the one who called," she announced, her eyes flickering between the officers and Jamal. "I just wanted to make sure everything was okay." Jamal's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Everything was okay before you called the cops on me," he muttered under his breath. Linda ignored him completely. Instead, she looked at the officers with a practiced innocence, as if she had just saved the neighborhood from some terrible danger. "I have never seen him before," she continued, shaking her head. "And I just thought, well, you can never be too careful these days, right?" The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Jamal knew exactly what she meant. And so did the officers. But instead of calling her out, they turned back to Jamal, still looking at him like he was the issue. Before the conversation could go any further, the front door to the house swung open, and out stepped Mr. Thompson. The old man stood on the porch, confused at first. Then his gaze locked onto the officers. "What in the world is going on here?" he demanded, his voice sharp despite his age. Linda's smug expression faltered. Jamal let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. Because now things were about to change. One of the officers turned toward Mr. Thompson, clearing his throat. "Sir, we got a report about a possible trespasser on your property." Mr. Thompson's eyes widened in disbelief. "A trespasser? Where?" The officer gestured toward Jamal. Mr. Thompson stared at him for a second, then burst out laughing. "You mean Jamal?" he scoffed. "He has been mowing my lawn for months. Who in their right mind thought he was a trespasser?" Silence. And then, slowly, all eyes turned to Linda. Linda backpedaled immediately, waving her hands. I didn't know," she sputtered. "I was just trying to be cautious." Mr. Thompson's expression hardened. "Cautious?" he repeated, his voice like steel. "You saw a kid doing honest work and assumed the worst?" Linda flushed deep red, but she refused to back down completely. "Well, I was just looking out for the neighborhood," she said weakly. Mr. Thompson's jaw clenched. "Lady, if you really wanted to help this neighborhood, you wouldn't be calling the cops on hard-working kids. You should be thanking him, not trying to get him arrested." Linda froze. The officers? They were silent now, because there was no justifying this anymore. She had called 911 on a kid doing yard work. And now? She was the one looking guilty. What happens next? The officers were no longer focused on Jamal. Now, they had a different issue to deal with. Because calling the police under false pretenses was a serious matter. And Linda was about to face consequences she never saw coming. Meanwhile, Jamal, he was about to get an opportunity that would change his life forever. Because when Mr. Thompson spoke next, he made a decision that would leave the entire neighborhood speechless. The air hung heavy with silence. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, the police officers were not looking at Jamal as the problem. Instead, their attention had completely shifted to Linda. And the longer the silence stretched, the redder her face became. She had called 911, expecting to be praised for her concern. But now, she was the one being questioned, and she did not know how to handle it. Officer Reynolds, the senior officer on scene, finally let out a long sigh before turning toward Linda. "Ma'am, I want to be very clear about something." Linda straightened up, trying to maintain her usual air of authority. "Yes, officer?" Reynolds tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Do you realize that filing a false police report is a crime?" Linda's mouth fell open slightly, and for the first time, panic flickered in her eyes. False? I wasn't lying, I was just mistaken. Officer Patel, the younger officer, crossed his arms. Mistaken about what exactly? He asked, his voice noticeably sharper now. Mistaken about a teenage boy doing his job? Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. I thought… No, Reynolds interrupted, shaking his head. You assumed. Linda sputtered, looking around as if hoping someone would step in and save her. But the neighbors? They were watching with disapproval. And Mr. Thompson? He was downright furious. Officer, Mr. Thompson said, stepping forward. What happens when someone repeatedly calls the police on innocent people? Is there a consequence for that? Linda spun toward him, eyes wide. Repeatedly? I have never. Mr. Thompson cut her off with a sharp laugh. Oh, please, Linda. You've been pulling this nonsense since the day you moved in. We all know it. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered neighbors. Linda turned bright red. That is not true. Mr. Thompson just shook his head. First it was the delivery driver, then the landscaper, then the babysitter across the street. And now a teenager mowing the lawn? He scoffed. When are you going to stop trying to police who belongs here? The weight of his words landed like a brick. And for the first time, Linda had nothing to say, because she knew he was right. Jamal had been quiet this whole time, watching everything unfold. But now, he took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. I have lived in this neighborhood my whole life, he said. And yet, I have had cops called on me twice both times, for just being outside. The officers exchanged an uncomfortable glance. Jamal turned to Linda, his gaze steady. Why? He asked simply. Linda opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because there was no excuse that could fix this. No justification that would not make her look even worse. Jamal shook his head. You know, if you really cared about this neighborhood, you would not be trying to get rid of the people who actually make it better. Linda flinched. Because once again, he was right. The officers looked at each other, clearly debating their next move. Finally, Officer Reynolds turned back to Linda. Ma'am, we are going to file this incident in our report, and if we receive another unnecessary call from you, you could be facing serious consequences. Linda gasped. Consequences? She repeated, her voice rising slightly. For being cautious? For wasting police resources, Officer Patel corrected, his tone unforgiving. And for targeting a teenager who did absolutely nothing wrong. Linda's face drained of color, because now, there was no doubt left. She had officially lost. Mr. Thompson let out a deep breath, rubbing his temple. Jamal, he said, turning to the teen, I am sorry you had to go through this. Jamal just shrugged lightly, though there was still frustration in his eyes. It's not the first time, he admitted. Probably won't be the last. That bothered Mr. Thompson more than anything. So he made a decision on that would change Jamal's life. You know what? Forget just mowing my lawn. I want to offer you something better. Jamal raised an eyebrow. Better? Mr. Thompson nodded. I own a landscaping business. I could use someone like you, hardworking, responsible. If you want, I can set you up with a job. Full pay, good hours, training included. Jamal's eyes widened. Are you serious? Mr. Thompson smiled. Dead serious, kid. The neighbors erupted into murmurs, impressed. And Linda? She looked like she had just swallowed a lemon. Because the very person she tried to bring down was now being lifted even higher. Linda turned on her heel, her pride too wounded to stay another second. She stormed back toward her house, face still red with anger and humiliation. But as she reached her porch, she heard one final sentence that made her freeze. Oh, and Linda? She turned back, heart pounding. It was Mr. Thompson. He smiled. Next time you need your lawn mowed, call Jamal. If he'll even take your business. The crowd laughed. And Linda? She slammed her door without another word. Because now, she was the real outsider in this neighborhood. What happens next? Jamal walked away, not as a victim but as a winner. He had turned a humiliating experience into an opportunity. And Linda? She had gotten exactly what she deserved. But what came next would be even more shocking, because within 24 hours, the video of this entire incident would go viral, and the whole world would know exactly what Linda had done. Linda thought the nightmare was over. She believed she could just go back inside, close her blinds, and pretend nothing had happened. But what she did not know was that this was just the beginning, because by the next morning, the entire world would know exactly what she had done. Unknown to Linda, several neighbors had been recording the entire incident from their porches. And one person in particular, Mia, a 17-year-old girl who lived 2 houses down, had uploaded the video to Facebook and TikTok before she even went to bed. The title? Karen calls cops on black teen mowing lawn, gets publicly humiliated. The internet ate it up. Within hours, the video was being shared everywhere. By the time Linda woke up the next morning, it already had 2.5 million views on TikTok, 500,000 shares on Facebook, thousands of comments, and none of them in her favor. And the reactions? Brutal. She really called the cops because a black kid was doing honest work? This is why people do not trust Karens. Just embarrassing. The way the old man stood up for Jamal, though? We love to see it. Jamal got a whole job offer out of this, and she just lost all her friends. Karma is beautiful. And then, it reached the news. By noon, several major news outlets had picked up the story. Headlines started appearing everywhere. Woman calls police on black teen mowing lawn. Gets reality check from officers. Racist 911 call backfires as teen lands Job instead of charges. Viral video sparks outrage. Community stands against false accusations. Linda could not believe it. Her face was everywhere. Her name was trending. And suddenly, she was the most hated woman in town. That afternoon, Linda went outside to check her mail, but the moment she stepped onto her porch, she felt it. The eyes of her neighbors, watching her. Some shook their heads. Others whispered among themselves. One woman, Mrs. Lopez from 2 houses down, just stood there, arms crossed, giving her a look of pure disappointment. For the first time in her life, Linda was the outsider, and she hated it. While Linda's life fell apart, Jamal's was just getting better. The landscaping job Mr. Thompson had offered? It turned into something even bigger, because after seeing the viral video, a well-known black business owner in town reached out to Jamal. His name was Robert Fields, owner of Fields Landscaping and Design, one of the most successful landscaping companies in the state. And he had an offer. "I started out just like you, kid," he told Jamal over the phone. "People tried to shut me down too, but I built something great, and I want to help you do the same." Jamal was speechless. Not only was Mr. Fields offering him a full-time job, but he also wanted to mentor him, helping him turn his small lawn-cutting business into something even bigger. And for the first time, Jamal saw a real future for himself. Meanwhile, Linda's problems kept piling up. Several neighbors had sent complaints to the Homeowners Association, HOA, about her repeated harassment of people in the community. And soon, she received a formal letter in the mail. She was being fined for her behavior. She was being warned that any future incidents could lead to legal action, and if she continued to disrupt the neighborhood, she could be forced to move. Linda was furious. "You cannot do this to me," she ranted at the next OA meeting. But the response? "No, Linda, you did this to yourself." And suddenly, she realized she had no allies left. Desperate, Linda tried to file a complaint against the police for harassing her. It was immediately dismissed. Then she tried contacting news stations, hoping to spin the story in her favor. None of them wanted to hear her side. One journalist even laughed on the phone before hanging up. With no other options left, Linda did the only thing she could think of. She put her house up for sale. Within a month, the for sale sign was up on her lawn. And by the end of the summer, she was gone. 1 year later, a completely different neighborhood. With Linda out of the picture, the neighborhood felt lighter. People were friendlier. There was less tension in the air. And Jamal? He was thriving. His landscaping business, with Mr. Fields' mentorship, had grown tremendously. He had multiple clients, better equipment, and even hired a few other teens to work with him. And Mr. Thompson? He still watched from his porch, a proud smile on his face whenever Jamal showed up to work. "Told you, kid," he said one day. "Hard work pays off." Jamal smiled back. "Yeah, but so does standing up for yourself." And with that, he fired up the lawnmower and got to work. Because he had a future to build, and no one was going to take that from him again. When people try to keep you down, stand tall. Success is the best response. If you believe in fighting for what's right, subscribe for more powerful stories.